A woman collapses on a frozen lake stripped bare by the snowstorm, trying to sing without a voice. In the distance, through the silent mist, a dapple-gray horse stands still, its eyes holding every sorrow ever whispered. When she utters her first fragile note after a year of silence, the ice beneath the horse begins to melt. No one believes a dead soul can listen. But in this story, the forgotten becomes the one who leads her back to life. Subscribe now to follow our haunting and healing storytelling film series. Before everything fell into silence, I used to believe my voice would always stay with me, like breath. Under the suffocating glow of stage lights, a velvet curtain quivered with the memory of applause. A single spotlight held steady center stage, casting a perfect circle on the lacquered floor. Silence pressed in from all sides, heavy theatrical. Then, like a snap of bone, the aria shattered. The note began full, bold, celestial, then died mid-phrase, torn apart by a soundless choke. A microphone tumbled from Amelia's hand and hit the floor with a hollow thud, the echo louder than any scream. The orchestra stopped. The world held its breath. For a moment, she stood frozen, not in dramatic flair or operatic pause, but truly paralyzed. Eyes wide, mouth open, reaching for a sound that would not come. Something ancient inside her had snapped. There was no standing ovation, no gasps, just the thick, crushing sound of absence made physical, as if someone had vacuumed the soul out of the room and left her standing in its void. Backstage, the chaos came in quiet movements. Crew members avoiding eye contact, her manager whispering rapid reassurances into a phone, someone awkwardly patting her on the shoulder like she'd just lost a dog. She walked straight past them all. She didn't remember changing out of her costume, didn't remember the ride in the black car with the leather seats that stuck to her arms. What she did remember was the cold, an unnatural cold crawling up from her chest, rooting into her throat. 3 days later, she sat in a white room that smelled like citrus disinfectant and wilted flowers. A young ENT specialist flipped through scans and charts, speaking in the kind of monotone usually reserved for weather forecasts or wars far away. Bilateral vocal cord paresis, likely trauma-induced. Possible nerve involvement, recovery uncertain, rest is critical. Words clattered around her like pebbles in a tin can. What about surgery, she asked. Or thought she asked. Her lips moved, but even now, 3 days later, the sound that came out was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. The doctor met her eyes gently, like he was approaching a skittish deer. The physical damage is one thing, Miss Vieira. But the neurological silence, your brain no longer trusting your voice to exist, that takes longer to repair. If it can. He handed her a sheet of paper vocal rest instructions list of therapists, something about trauma response. It might as well have been a death certificate. The car ride home was silent, but not peacefully so. The driver occasionally glanced in the mirror, unsure if she'd cry or scream or vanish. Amelia stared out the window. Outside, the city buzzed with brutal normalcy, bus stops, blinking lights, steam rising from subway grates. Inside, she dissolved. Her voice was gone. Her career, too. But deeper than that, her sense of self. She wasn't a person who sang. She was the singing. The aria made flesh. Now she was just flesh, left behind by sound. At home, the apartment was a museum of her own echo. Framed posters of sold-out performances, gilded awards collecting dust, the grand piano glaring at her like a disappointed father. She poured herself wine she couldn't taste and tried not to scream, knowing tragically she couldn't. Night came hard. In sleep, she dreamed of tunnels made of sheet music where every note dissolved under her feet. She fell endlessly clutching for a chord that would not hold. Waking was worse. Her own breath frightened her. It came in stutters, unsure. 2 weeks passed like molasses. People called. She didn't answer. Her manager left a message saying the press was being compassionate but curious. Some radio show ran a segment, The Voice That Broke. They played her last performance, the part before the collapse, then filled the silence with speculation. One morning, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and tried again. Just one note. Just one. She opened her mouth, took in air, and pushed. Nothing. Her throat seized, her eyes blurred. The woman staring back at her was not a singer, not even a ghost. She was a relic, a failed cathedral. That afternoon, a letter arrived from a hospice in Ontario. Her mother's belongings had finally been cleared after her passing months ago. A modest inheritance, a cabin untouched. She hadn't gone back, not since the funeral. Not since they lowered her mother, her first audience, into the frozen earth beneath a tangle of cedar and snow. Her mother used to say, "The snow knows how to listen. That's why it's always quiet." Amelia booked the trip within the hour. The city tried to grip her as she left its noise, its expectations, its echo chamber of failure. But she moved like water around it, slipping out before anyone could beg her to stay or perform some symbolic act of resilience. She packed only what fit in a single suitcase, a winter coat, a scarf her mother knitted, and a pocket-sized score of La Wally the aria she never finished. The flight to Ontario was forgettable, except for the silence inside her. She didn't even bring music. She was afraid to hear others doing what she couldn't. The plane landed in a hush of gray sky and frostbitten light. Outside, a driver waited, holding a cardboard sign, A. Vieira. She nodded. No words. The driver seemed relieved. They drove for hours. The city thinned, then vanished. Roads grew narrower. Trees leaned in. Snow began to layer the world like a shroud. Somewhere past the last cell signal, the driver pointed and said, "That's your cabin. Keys in the mailbox. Watch for coyotes." She nodded again. Still mute. Not just from loss, but by choice now. Words felt too fragile, too close to cracking. The cabin was a memory preserved in ice. Dust on the windows, firewood stacked like forgotten promises. Her mother's rocking chair still sat on the porch, facing the woods. Inside, the air smelled of pine and time. The silence was different here. Not empty, not cruel, just waiting. She didn't unpack. She walked to the window, looked out over the lake, now frozen solid. The trees were skeletons etched against a pearl-gray sky. Everything seemed to hold its breath. That night, she lit the fireplace with shaking hands, sat cross-legged before it. The flames flickered against the walls, painting shadows that moved like dancers behind a veil. She didn't cry. She had passed the need for tears. Instead, she pulled out the aria sheet, stared at the notes she once wore like skin. Her fingers traced them, and in her mind, only in her mind, she sang. It didn't matter that no sound came. The melody remembered her. It circled her like wind, like her mother's lullabies sung in soft Italian, like the warmth of a stage light long extinguished. She went to bed without speaking. Snow fell all night. By morning, the world had vanished under white. A blank page. A silence, yes, but not absence. A hush that seemed to whisper, "Try again." She stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, steam rising from her coffee. Then she heard it. Faint. Far off. Not imagined. A sound, not human. A soft, ragged whinny carried on the wind, like a secret returned. She froze. Beyond the trees, something moved. She stepped forward, and for the first time in weeks, her lips parted, not to scream, but to listen. Under the heavy silence of snow-thick dawn, the world in Ontario had shrunk to its most essential parts, white breath and memory. The cabin Amelia now called hers stood hunched beneath the weight of winter, like a forgotten organ in a body that no longer sang. Built of old timber and stubborn nails, it crouched at the edge of a frozen lake, barely visible beneath layers of snow that muffled every sound and gesture. Even light moved slower here, filtering through the gray, with the hesitation of someone unsure they were welcome. Inside, everything breathed in hush. The fireplace had long since burned out, leaving only the soft crackle of cold ash and the echo of flames in the soot-stained stone. Amelia sat curled in the corner of the couch, knees to chest cocooned in her mother's shawl. She hadn't spoken since arriving, not even to herself. Language felt performative now, an echo of a self she wasn't sure existed anymore. She hadn't tried to sing again, not since that morning on the porch when she'd heard the horse. It had been real. She was certain. The sound hadn't come from inside her head. She knew the difference. It had drifted in through the trees like a memory someone else had forgotten to keep. Low, elongated. Not the wild call of a stallion, but a quieter sound, like a cello mourning itself. But since then, nothing. Just the snow and the long stretching arms of silence. She'd started going out in the early mornings before the sky had the courage to turn blue. Wrapped in layers, boots crunching on old frost, she would walk slowly down the ridge, past the birch line to where the snow dipped in a shallow basin thick with drift and still untouched by anything but wind. There she would stand still, listening. That's what she was doing now. 7:09 a.m. Frost kissed her eyebrows. Her breath made small, desperate clouds that died quickly. She stood alone in the expanse, surrounded by trees like tall skeletal guardians. From behind, she looked at more shadow than woman, just a dark figure carved against the white. Her back was narrow, shoulders curled in, slightly not from cold, but from long-held grief. The kind of posture you earn over time, when the world teaches you that being heard can hurt. Every muscle in her body seemed caught between shrinking and screaming. Then she opened her mouth. No warm-up, no breath control, no technique. Just the raw animal instinct to shout. Nothing came out. Her jaw trembled. She tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through her like electricity on water. She clenched her fists and dug them into her sides, shaking, then raised both hands and screamed into the sky without a sound. Her face, twisted eyes, while my mouth stretched neck cords tight. A perfect scream, except it was silent. And then her knees gave out. She dropped into the snow like a marionette, with its strings cut, shoulders heaving, sobs twisting her frame. Her face buried in her palms. Tears came, hot, shameful, the kind that felt like confession. She wasn't just grieving the loss of voice, she was grieving everything she had tied to it, every stage, every ovation, every childhood memory of her mother whispering, "You were born to be heard." Now not even the snow replied. She stayed like that for a long time, until the crunch of footsteps broke through the hush like a foreign language. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, bending branches, snapping frost. But the cadence was too human, uneven, paired. She looked up. A man stood about 20 feet away, hands in the pockets of a long, worn coat the color of pine bark. He had the stillness of someone who lived in places where silence mattered. His beard was white, full, unkempt, but his eyes were sharp amber hazel and clear like old glass. He looked at her, not startled, not concerned, just curious. She tried to speak, to explain, to apologize. He raised a hand, gently stopping her. "No need," he said, voice like split wood in morning fog. "I used to scream at this spot, too. Long time ago." Amelia blinked. He nodded, stepping closer with careful steps. Boots making soft sounds in the snow. "Name's Elios," he said. "Used to be a trainer with the traveling circuses. Now I dig graves for animals that don't have people." She furrowed her brow. He smiled, not unkind. "There's a small cemetery past the ridge back where the trees get thick. Horses, dogs, a bear once even. Some circus folks never came back to claim them. I stayed." Amelia stood slowly, brushing snow from her coat. Her throat ached with unsaid words. "I saw you yesterday," he continued. "By the lake. You were listening for it, weren't you?" She looked up sharply. "The whinny," he said. "The ghost horse." Her breath caught. Elios sighed and walked past her, motioning for her to follow. She did tentative crunching through the snow behind him, like a shadow, unwilling to commit. "I don't tell this story to many people," he said. "Most think it's folklore or guilt. Same thing, really." They walked in silence for a few minutes. Then they crested a small hill, and below, nested in a clearing of white, was a field dotted with carved stones, some real, some made of wood. Markers, dozens of them. "This was the final winter camp of the Rivaldi Circus," Elios said. "Back in '73. We were doing our last season. Money was tight, animals overworked, performers breaking down. We had a gray horse, Miro, smartest creature I ever knew. Could dance to Strauss play dead on cue. But he hated fire, hated it." He paused, touching the rim of a gravestone. "On our closing night, someone knocked over a kerosene lamp backstage. Tent went up in seconds. Panic, screams. The lion broke loose. I tried to get Miro out, but his tether had jammed. He thrashed so hard I thought he'd break his legs. In the end, I ran." The silence that followed was thicker than any snow. Amelia stared at him, eyes wide, heart pounding. "They said he died fast," Elios said. "But I know better. I hear him sometimes, especially in storms. He doesn't scream like a man. He sings, like he's still waiting for the cue." He turned to her now, gaze direct. "And lately, I've been hearing him more. Which is strange. Ghosts usually fade, not get louder." Amelia opened her mouth. No sound came, but her eyes said everything. He studied her for a long time, then nodded slowly. Maybe he's not the only one trying to be heard. They stood there, two silent figures, in a graveyard of forgotten beasts, both haunted by performances that had gone terribly wrong. "You know," Elios said, "some say, when the snow falls just right, it records sound, stores it. That's why the forest seems to breathe here. It's not wind, it's memory." Amelia looked around, letting that sink in. "Come by tomorrow," he added. "I'll show you the old tent frame. Still standing somehow. Miro's post is there too, burned black." She nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He took a harmonica from his coat pocket, blew a single note. Soft, fragile. The sound hung in the air like a question. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, boots trailing solemn rhythm through the snow. Alone again, Amelia turned back toward her cabin. The world hadn't changed, but something inside her had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. Enough for something else to begin. Under the bruised sky of a midwinter morning, the storm began without warning. No gentle buildup. No quiet foreshadow. It came roaring through the trees like a warning whispered too late. Amelia had barely zipped her coat when the wind punched the side of the cabin, sending flurries sideways in violent spirals. Snow clawed at the windows, desperate to be let in. She should have stayed inside, but something pulled her. That same low magnetic hum beneath the silence. The place in her chest that felt like an empty auditorium, vast, aching, desperate to echo. She wrapped a scarf tight around her throat, pulled on her boots with trembling hands, and stepped outside. The storm wrapped around her instantly, a wall of white noise. Her breath was snatched from her lungs. She pushed forward anyway, blindly letting her body remember the path she had taken each morning. Trees blurred. The horizon disappeared. She moved by instinct, not sight. And then everything stopped. Not literally. The wind still screamed. The snow still clawed. But time bent, because there it was, 30 paces ahead. A figure, tall, still, gray as ash and snow. A horse, no bridle, no saddle. Just standing half obscured in the storm, its mane streaming like smoke in the wind, eyes fixed on her. It didn't move. Neither did she. The cold ceased to matter. The storm fell away. It was just the two of them, suspended in a silence more deafening than the gale. The horse's gaze wasn't wild, not the skittish eyes of a feral creature. It was steady, old, and filled with something she didn't understand. Recognition, judgment, sorrow. She took one step forward. The snow crunched faintly beneath her. The horse blinked. Its ears twitched. She opened her mouth. She didn't know why. Reflex, maybe? Something primitive. Something rooted in every cell of her body that still remembered song, even after her voice forgot. She whispered. The sound came thin and broken like wind moving through cracked glass. But then the horse tilted its head and let out a single low, aching whinny. Not loud, not wild. It trembled with something older than pain, like it was searching for a key to a door, long sealed shut. And as that sound touched her ears, something inside her chest shattered. Without thinking, without form, Amelia exhaled. A note left her lips. Clear, soft, real, a real note. Just one, but it vibrated in her throat like the warmth of a hand long lost. She gasped, staggered slightly. The horse didn't flinch. It simply turned its head almost gently, then began to walk away, vanishing into the storm with slow, deliberate steps. And then it was gone. Amelia stood there stunned. The silence rushed back, but it felt different now. Charged, alive. Like the air had memorized her voice and refused to let it go. When she finally turned to walk back, she didn't cry. She didn't smile either. What settled in her was older than joy, more frightening than grief. Hope. But it was a dangerous hope. Because what if it had been a trick? What if the note had been coincidence, some throat reflex, or snow-framed hallucination? She spent the next hours pacing the cabin, touching her throat, whispering into mirrors, replaying the encounter. She pulled out the aria sheet again, mouthing the phrases, silently willing the sound to return. But it didn't. The voice came once and only once. By dusk, her mind turned in circles. Maybe it had never happened. Maybe the grief had finally split her in two, and this was the birth of madness. She sat curled in front of the fire, fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, eyes locked on the flames, when a loud knock shattered the stillness. She jumped. Another knock. She opened the door slowly, heart punching her ribs. On the porch stood a girl, maybe 19, wearing a thick green parka splattered with dried paint and a canvas messenger bag slung across her chest. Her cheeks were pink from the cold eyes, sharp and curious, beneath a curtain of dark hair braided in streaks of ochre and turquoise. "You're the singer, right?" the girl asked without waiting for permission to speak. Amelia blinked, startled. The girl pointed at a mural on the side of the cabin, a half-finished painting Amelia hadn't noticed. A rising silhouette of a horse formed from swirling lines of smoke and fire. "I painted that this morning. I heard you come out during the storm. Figured you'd see it better if it had eyes." She grinned, lopsided. "Name's Naya." Amelia opened her mouth. Nothing came. Naya didn't seem surprised. "Yeah, I know. Folks say you can't talk anymore. But I don't need you to talk. I just came to say don't freak out if the horse comes back." Amelia's breath caught. Naya stepped inside without asking, kicking snow from her boots. "My mom says that horse's spirit still wanders when the air turns glassy. I used to think she was nuts, but I've seen it too, especially near the burnt field." She shrugged. "It likes music. Or maybe it just likes people who used to believe in it." Amelia tried to write something, grabbed the closest notepad. Her fingers fumbled. Naya waved it off. Don't bother. I talk enough for both of us. She walked over to the painting, running her hand along the mural's rough texture. People think I'm crazy for painting animals all over buildings. Graffiti with a spirit animal fetish, one teacher called it. But I don't care. I paint to remember. They were here first. Amelia watched her. There was something wild and unfiltered in the girl, like she carried the wind in her spine and snow in her blood. And beneath that hurt. A kind of armor disguised as ease. I used to sing too, Naya added suddenly, almost absently. Not opera. Just songs, campfire stuff. But Mom told me to stop, said opera wasn't ours, said it was the music of the colonizers, said it didn't belong to us. She laughed dryly. But that's bullshit, right? Music's not land. You don't own it. It owns you. Amelia's chest tightened. Naya turned to her. You think your voice is gone for good? Amelia hesitated, then shook her head. Naya nodded like she expected nothing less. Good, she said. Because that horse, it doesn't waste time on people who've given up. Before she left, Naya pulled a small tube of red paint from her bag. She knelt and added a single line to the mural, just under the eye of the horse. A teardrop. Then she stood and smiled. I'll be around, she said. You'll hear me before you see me. And then she vanished into the snow, her footsteps painting new paths across the white. Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, for a long time, eyes locked on that single red drop beneath the horse's eye. A tear, not of sadness, but of memory, recognition, of something that had seen too much fire to forget. Each morning before sunrise, Amelia stepped into the cold like a ritual, wrapped in the same wool shawl her mother had once worn on silent forest walks. She descended the hill from her cabin boots, crunching over crusted snow. The wind had softened lately, no longer cutting, just whispering along the treetops. Still, the temperature held it brutal. But she went. Every day. Same hour, same spot. Waiting. It had been 5 days since the horse reappeared. Each time, always at the edge of the clearing, always just before the sky hinted blue, he would emerge like a breath exhaled by the forest. Gray. Still. Watchful. She never tried to touch him. Instead, she would stand just a few feet away and breathe. That's how it started. Breathwork. Not performance, not training. Just breathing. Inhale to feel. Exhale to survive. When she felt steady enough, she added motion, arms rising like wings, hands shaping vowels in the air, as if teaching snow to listen. She mimicked the phrasing of aria, but silently, her body becoming the voice. Fingers danced in rhythms only she and the wind knew. On the third morning, something shifted. She let her lips part, let sound escape. Just one note, soft, cracked, but it was hers. And in that instant, as if by some pact with nature itself, the snow beneath the horse's hooves began to melt, just slightly, a small dark circle spreading beneath him. A steaming impression of heat returned to earth. She blinked. He didn't move. He just watched, and every day after it happened again. The more she sang, however faint, however breathless, the more the snow receded around him. The world responding not to power, but presence. The frost did not need grandeur. It just needed proof that something alive still pulsed beneath. She didn't speak of it. Not to Elios, not to Naya. It was something between her and the animal. Or rather, between what remained of both of them. One morning, she arrived late. The sun had already painted the tips of the trees in gold. The horse was gone. The clearing felt colder than usual. She fell to her knees in the snow, pressing her hand to the imprint where he'd stood before. Still faintly warm, she whispered, "Don't leave me." And though no one was there to hear it, the air seemed to hold the plea. Later that afternoon, she returned to the cemetery. Elios stood beneath the arch of an old cedar, his back to her. The shadows of the trees cut across his coat like bars. He was digging again, this time for a red fox hit by a logging truck. The world's collateral. He didn't look up. "Thought you'd be back." Amelia waited for the silence to open. "He came again," she wrote on the small notepad she now carried. Elios nodded. "I sang," she added. He stayed. This time the old man did look at her. His face weathered by snow and regret softened. "Then you're further along than I ever got." They sat together beneath the oldest grave marker, an iron loop rusted and bent. "His name was Miro Elios," said finally. She froze. "I used to call him my mirror." He smiled. "Because he reflected whatever you gave him. Kindness, fear, rage. He mirrored it right back. Smartest horse I ever worked with. Learned choreography faster than half the troop." Amelia scrawled. "You were in the show." He laughed, the sound like a branch cracking under snow. "Trainer, handler sometimes, clown, sometimes janitor. We were a traveling family stitched together by bruises and boredom. We weren't exactly welcome in towns. We were the sideshow to a society that didn't want to look too close at itself." He ran a gloved hand over the iron loop. We had a contortionist with a curved spine, a fire eater with burn scars down his legs, a woman with a beard who could outsing 10 men, a boy who never spoke but played violin like the devil himself. And the animals? We rescued most of them from places worse than cages. We gave them names, purpose, but not freedom. Amelia leaned closer. Was that the cost, she wrote? Elio stared at the question for a long time. It's the lie we told ourselves, he said. That giving them a role meant giving them dignity. But it was still a performance. They were still behind bars. He reached into his coat and pulled out an old photo creased water-stained. In it, a young man stood beside a tall gray horse, both dressed in velvet and sequins. The man smiled wide. The horse looked solemn. Amelia traced the photo with her fingertip. Miro. Elias tucked the picture away. You know what haunts me? He asked. She shook her head. It wasn't the fire. It was the last sound I heard before I ran. The tent had gone up fast. Screams, chaos, flames everywhere. I tried to get to Miro, but his tether burned hot. My coat caught fire. I had to jump clear. He paused. But right before I hit the snow, I heard him sing. Amelia blinked. Not whinny, not cry, not scream. Sing. This long, drawn-out note, like he was trying to hold the whole show together with his breath. Elios's voice cracked. I've heard that sound every winter since. Amelia stared at him. Then, very slowly, she lifted her hand to her throat, placed it over her heart, and mimicked a breath into a rising note, her fingers trailing skyward like smoke. Elios watched. You heard it too, didn't you? She nodded. He stood slowly, walked to the burned tree stump near the edge of the cemetery. That, he said, pointing, was where the main pole stood. The heart of the tent. We never rebuilt. Amelia stepped forward. On the wood blackened by time and heat, she saw something she hadn't before. Scratches. Not letters, not symbols, just grooves, marks of panic or defiance. She reached out and touched them. The cold jumped into her skin like electricity, and suddenly she saw it, not with her eyes, but with something behind them. A flash of color, crimson curtains, a girl in white. Music swelling, fire blooming from the ceiling like a demonic flower. A horse thrashing, eyes wild, then locking onto hers, not hers, another girl. A child, singing through the fire. And the horse, calming. For a second, before, she pulled her hand back, gasping. Elio steadied her. You saw her, didn't you? He whispered. She nodded, tears welling. Some say Miro wasn't just burned. He was called, pulled back into the fire because someone he loved was still in there. The girl, the one who used to sing to him before every show. She died that night. He stayed with her. Amelia wiped her cheek. This place, Elio said, scanning the cemetery, was a haven for the forgotten. But we still failed them. He turned to her. You might be the first person he's chosen to come back for. Amelia looked at the ground, then back at him. No, she mouthed. Elios tilted his head. She pointed at herself, then opened her hand palm to the sky. He came back for us, she wrote, for all who lost their voice, their role, their name. She stared at the melting patch of snow that had formed in the clearing this morning, and something inside her cracked. A quiet, steady belief. Not that she would sing again, but that her silence had been heard, and that mattered. The dreams began 3 nights after Amelia touched the scorched stump in the graveyard. Not like ordinary dreams. These arrived like memories stolen from another soul. In the first, the world was velvet lush reds and royal blues, curtains parting as a spotlight fell on sawdust and sequins. There was music, always music, wistful climbing a scale that never quite resolved. And then fire, licking upward like a golden serpent, smoke spinning above the ring thick as breath. And the horse, always the horse, barreling through the chaos, eyes wide with wet fear, then stopping, turning, looking, not at her, but through her, like he saw someone else behind her ribcage. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The next night, the dream returned longer this time. She was running barefoot through a corridor of fabric and flame. Voices screamed. Wood cracked. She passed a mirror and didn't recognize herself. Saw a girl much younger barefoot holding a piece of candy in one hand and a stuffed animal in the other. A voice sang softly from somewhere above, a lullaby in Italian. Then the ceiling caved. She woke with blood in her mouth. She had bitten her tongue. The third night shattered her. This time the dream bled into memory. She was standing just outside the ring. The crowd was laughing, children clapping. The ringmaster bowed. Then music. A strange echo of La Wally, but in a child's voice, soft, timid. A girl kneeling beside the gray horse, brushing its mane, singing it to sleep before the show. The horse nuzzled her shoulder. Then someone knocked over a lamp. It all turned to ash. Amelia jerked awake, flung herself from the bed, and vomited into the sink. Her hands trembled as she washed her face with snowmelt from the basin. The cabin was silent, but the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. She didn't go out that morning. Instead, she sat by the firearms wrapped around herself, throat raw, not from use, but from grief. There was something the dreams were asking her to see, but every time she reached for it, her mind recoiled. By dusk, she couldn't bear it anymore. She put on her coat and walked toward the graveyard. Elios was already there. He stood over a fresh patch of earth, lighting a candle in a storm glass. He didn't turn when she approached. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked softly. "In your sleep?" She nodded. He looked down at the flame. "I used to think dreams were the mind's way of throwing out the garbage. Now, I think they're letters. Messages. If you're brave enough to read them." She handed him the notepad. "I saw a girl, singing to Miro. Was she real?" He stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he sat. "She was." Amelia knelt beside him. Her name was Leora. Her parents worked the trapeze. She was only 7 when they brought her into the circus. Didn't perform. Too shy. But she had a voice like a bell dipped in honey. Every night she'd sneak into the stables and sing to Miro. Same lullaby. He wouldn't sleep without it. He took a breath, long and heavy. The night of the fire, she wasn't supposed to be backstage. But someone said she'd hidden in the feed barrels, hoping to see the show from behind the curtain. When the flames started, we all ran. I didn't know she was missing until hours later. His eyes turned glassy. We found what was left of her beside Miro's tether post. Burned. Curled up. Like she never moved. Amelia felt the air leave her lungs. The dream hadn't been a dream. It had been a memory. Not hers. "Miro stayed because of her," she wrote. Elias nodded. "He chose her, just like he's choosing you." She hesitated. "Why me?" Elias tilted his head. "What aria were you singing that night when your voice broke?" She paused. "Lawali." His eyes darkened. That was Leora's song. Amelia blinked. She sang it every night. In her own way. Off-key sometimes. But Miro, he knew the tune, responded to it. The world tilted. Amelia stood stepping back, winded. Everything locked into place like bones, clicking after a long dislocation. It hadn't been chance. The aria, the collapse, the voice breaking, the return of the horse. None of it was random. She wasn't healing him. He was calling her, calling the part of her that had burned and never been buried. She stumbled from the cemetery and walked until her knees gave out near the edge of the frozen lake. There in the silence, she saw her reflection in the ice. Not just her face, 100 versions of it. The child who stood in the wings, watching her mother teach voice to girls in a community center. The teenager mocked for singing operatic scales in the school bathroom. The woman who clutched the microphone like a lifeline until the aria collapsed in her throat. And beneath them all, a girl in ash, Leora. They shared something, both lost in fire, both unfinished songs. She pressed her hand to the ice. The cold burned like truth. For the first time, she whispered not to sing, not to speak, but to admit, "I was never whole." And in that moment, a breath of warmth pulsed beneath her palm. She looked up. Across the lake, half shadowed by trees, stood Miro. His eyes glowed faintly in the twilight. Not demanding, not judging, just waiting. And Amelia understood. She wasn't the healer. She was the bridge between the voice that died and the voice that might live again. Between a girl who burned and a woman who froze. Between memory and song. She closed her eyes and began to hum. The cold had grown sharper. Not crueler, just more honest. It no longer bit at Amelia's skin like punishment. It settled into her bones, like truth. The kind of truth you no longer fight but carry. Not with pride, not with shame, just because it is yours. On the 46th morning, she stood at the edge of the frozen lake as a dawn began to soften the horizon. The light had that watery hue, the one that only winter knows, like the sun had to ask permission to rise. She wore no coat, no gloves, no scarf. Just a linen dress that hung from her like memory. The frost stung her skin, but she didn't flinch. Her breath curled into the air, thin and rhythmic. She closed her eyes, lifted her face to the sky, and raised her arms like she might catch a note falling from heaven. Then she opened her mouth. No sound came, just breath. But it wasn't empty. It came from a place deeper than vocal cords, somewhere between grief and grace. A breath that wasn't meant to be heard, but felt. A silent aria. Each exhale shaped the contours of a song that used to belong to her. Tears began to fall. Not as collapse, but as translation. Her body remembered what her voice forgot. Each tear a syllable, each tremble a crescendo. The lake didn't answer. The wind didn't shift. But something shifted inside her. The silence had texture now. The silence was listening. She dropped to her knees on the ice chest, heaving. her hands pressed flat on the frozen surface like prayer. No drama. No audience. No revival fantasy. Just a woman and her unfinished song. Behind her, footsteps approached. Naya. She didn't speak. Didn't intrude. Just sat beside Amelia, pulling a small paintbrush from her coat pocket and opening a pouch of colors she had ground herself, charcoal berries ash. With slow, reverent movements, she began to paint on the ice. Not a picture to last. Not something to be preserved. Just an offering. The shape took form, a gray horse. Eyes closed, head bowed. A single flame above its back, frozen mid-flicker. I never met him, Naya said softly. But I feel like I knew him, in some weird way. Amelia nodded, still kneeling. Naya dipped her brush in a darker hue. You know, my mother used to sing too. Only to herself, in our language. She said it was the only place we were allowed to be loud. Everywhere else, we had to shrink. She painted the horse's hooves, made them strong. She told me opera was for white halls and marble statues. That it wasn't our story. But I don't believe that anymore. Not since you. Your silence says things the world's been deaf to for years. Amelia closed her eyes. Then she stood. She walked back to the cabin, slowly barefoot now, leaving prints like fading lyrics in the snow. When she reached the porch, she turned. Across the lake, Miro stood. Not ghostly now, solid, majestic. The snow around him had melted into a perfect circle. Steam rose from the earth, like breath from the past. Amelia took one step forward. He didn't move. She raised her hand, and this time she sang. The first note broke the world open. It wasn't flawless, it wasn't strong, but it was real. Her voice trembled like a candle newly lit. Then steadied, grew, became. She sang La Wally, the aria that had shattered her, the aria that had saved her, the aria Leora once sang to a frightened horse under a circus tent. The words poured from her as if they had always been waiting for this moment, not in front of an audience, not beneath stage lights, but here in the arms of winter, between the breath of one life and the memory of another. The trees listened, the lake hummed, and the people came. From the village, from the ridges, from the cabins and the woods. They came not because they were invited, but because something in the air called them. Something ancient. Something unfinished. They stood around this cabin, forming a wide circle in the snow. They said nothing. They just listened. Some wept. Others placed their hands over their chests. One man dropped to his knees and whispered a name the wind had taken years ago. A woman held her daughter tighter. Even the dogs fell silent. Naya stood against the cabin wall painting. Her hands moved quickly now, urgently. On the wooden panels of the cabin, the gray horse took shape, life-sized eyes wide and knowing mid-stride. Flames curled in his mane. Snow dripped from his hooves. The last note lingered, not into silence, but into stillness. Miro lowered his head. Then he shimmered. His body began to dissolve, not with drama, not in pain, but like a sigh being released. First his mane, then his flanks, then his hooves, until only his eyes remained. They locked with Amelia's, not in farewell, but in recognition. Then they too vanished. The melted snow beneath where he had stood slowly cooled. Steam lifted, curled, and faded into the sky. Amelia stood alone once more, but this time she did not feel alone. She turned back to the cabin, the mural complete, the people watching. No applause, no ovation, just reverence. She placed her hand on the painted horse's heart and whispered not for them, but for him. You've been heard. The city was louder than she remembered. Even from the window of the car that slid through its early evening veins, Amelia could feel the static in the air. Horns, screens, brakes, voices, neon. 1,000 tiny demands for attention stacked like bricks. It pressed against the glass as if trying to crawl back into her chest. But she was no longer the same hollow chamber it once knew. The theater was nestled in a corner of the old district, an opera house, with columns like stone lungs and chandeliers that once hummed to her voice. Tonight they would hum again, but not yet. Amelia stepped out of the car without ceremony. She wore black, a long, unbroken silhouette. Her hands were bare, her hair pulled back, her face empty of powder. She looked like truth. There was no red carpet, no fanfare, just people. A line that curved around the block, silent, bundled in coats, holding programs printed on recycled paper. On the cover, a sketched image of a gray horse, eyes closed. Above it, Nguyen Sam, the silent aria. Inside, the lobby breathed quietly. Ushers wore no uniforms, only silver scarves. There was no sound system playing overtures. Just the soft hush of snow falling in memory. Guests moved through the space like they were entering a sacred place, not a spectacle. The stage was dark when the audience filled their seats. At exactly 8:13 p.m., the house lights dimmed, not all at once, but like sunlight slipping from between clouds. The curtain did not rise. Instead, the screen above the proscenium lit up. No title, no credits. Just snow, falling endlessly across a blank white landscape. Then the sound of breath. Not singing, just breath. The first image appeared a woman back-turned standing in the middle of a frozen lake. Wind tugged at her dress. The gray shape of a horse watching her from the tree line. Then came others. The mural on the side of the cabin. The red teardrop under the painted eye. A close-up of frost melting from bark, revealing old claw marks. A flame caught mid-dance, slowed to the point of stillness. An aria stitched entirely from silence, where the music was in what was not said. The screen faded to black. The curtain rose, and Amelia stood alone beneath a single beam of cold light. The stage was empty. No orchestra, no backdrop. Only her. A microphone waited before her. Simple, unadorned. On its stem, just below the windscreen, a phrase was carved by hand, so faint it almost vanished beneath the gloss. She stepped forward slowly. The camera above zoomed in on the carving. The room inhaled. She didn't speak, didn't bow, just stood there and closed her eyes. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, from remembering, from release. When she opened her mouth, the first note came soft, not weak soft, like a breath made holy. It rose, gently curling through the air like steam from a forgotten cup of tea. Then another, then more. Each phrase climbed the silence as if apologizing for having been gone so long. And the aria began. It wasn't La Wally as it had been taught in conservatories. It was something older, something deeper, like a mountain calling its own name. Her voice cracked mid-phrase, but she didn't stop. She didn't retreat to perfection. She stepped through it, made the fracture part of the melody. The song trembled, then soared, like a wound learning how to dance. The people in the audience leaned forward, hands folded, mouths parted. Some cried without knowing why. Some remembered names they hadn't spoken in years. One man removed his hearing aids just to feel the music undiluted. When Amelia reached the aria's final passage, her knees buckled slightly. She sank, not to the floor, but into herself, her hands pressed against her chest, as if anchoring her spirit in her ribs. The last note didn't end. It dissolved, a pure aching resonance that filled every corner of the hall, and then silence. No applause, no movement, just breath, just memory. Then slowly, the audience began to rise. Not in ovation, but in recognition. They didn't clap. They placed their hands over their hearts. A wave of stillness swept the hall. Someone whispered, "Thank you," and it echoed louder than thunder. Behind Amelia, the screen came back on. One last image. A patch of snow melted into the shape of a hoofprint. Inside it, a single note drawn in ink. A fermata, the symbol for holding a note longer than its value, as long as the soul requires. Lights dimmed. Curtains fell. And the woman, who once lost her voice, walked off stage, not to reclaim anything, but to offer it freely. Amelia didn't vanish after the concert. She didn't retreat into silence or lock herself inside some sacred artist's seclusion. She walked straight down the stage stairs past the velvet curtains and flashless cameras and into the city street where the night was raw and unscripted. She stood there for a long time, watching snow drift onto the steps of the opera house like ash falling upward. The aria had been sung, but something unfinished still lingered inside her. Not emptiness, space, and she knew exactly what to fill it with. In the weeks that followed, her name surged across headlines again. But not for the reason they expected. Not for comebacks, not for awards, not even for the strange haunting performance that broke an entire city's voice with one note. It was for the project. Listen to the forgotten. A movement, a manifesto, a whisper that became a wave. It started with a single video. Just her, no makeup, no soundtrack, sitting beside a shelter dog with cloudy eyes. She whispered, not sang, a message to the camera. "This is Milo. He once sang every morning in the courtyard until the day no one answered. I don't want to give him a voice. I want to give you the ears to hear him." Then the screen went black. It ended with just one phrase. "Who have you stopped hearing?" It spread like wildfire through frost. Within days, artists and strangers alike began submitting recordings not of themselves, but of others. Forgotten ones. A violinist in a psych ward. A boy with autism humming in an abandoned train station. A feral cat purring next to a retired nurse's heartbeat. A janitor tapping Morse code on lunchroom tables. The foundation was real and growing. Part shelter, part archive, part stage. Its doors opened not to those who wanted to perform, but to those who wanted to witness. A quiet place, no cameras, just seats and sound and listening. And every Sunday, a name would be read aloud, someone who had passed away unremembered, followed by a piece of music they once loved. Sometimes a cassette recording, sometimes a scratched vinyl, sometimes just someone else humming for them. The city changed, not overnight, but deeply. Coffee shops set up listening hours. No phones, no orders. Just a single voice on loop telling a true story from someone most had never heard of. Children were taught how to sit in silence for 2 minutes each morning to hear what the world forgot to say yesterday. Museums began to collect unedited audio diaries from hospice patients. Even the subway speakers, once droning with ads, were interrupted once a day by a minute of silence dedicated to someone whose voice once echoed in its tunnels. One afternoon, a mural appeared on the side of a school. It was unmistakable. The gray horse, running not standing, flame in its mane, snow on its hooves, and beneath it in careful brushstrokes, "Your voice didn't disappear. We just weren't quiet enough to hear it." Amelia never claimed credit. She walked through the movement like wind through tall grass, bending things, but never breaking them. She visited small towns, animal shelters, community centers. Never as a singer, always as a listener. And she never mentioned Miro again. Until that final winter morning, Ontario had thawed. The snow had started pulling back reluctantly, as if it wasn't quite ready to let go. Ice cracked on the lake's surface in long, echoing yawns. Amelia stood once more at the water's edge. This time she wasn't alone. Dozens had gathered. Children, elders, strangers who had once been alone and now stood shoulder to shoulder. And in the front row, Elios and Naya, hand in hand, the old and the new, two keepers of memory. Naya had painted one last image onto a flat slab of cedar, then carried it on her back across 3 valleys to bring it here. It was Miro, not as a ghost, not as flame, but as freedom. No tether, no chain, just sky behind him, a gray smear of movement, a blur of becoming. Elios wore his old trainer's coat frayed and faded, with a small red ribbon pinned to the lapel. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it on Amelia's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, voice thin. She smiled gently, then stepped onto the lake. The ice groaned beneath her, but held. She walked to the center, where the song first broke through, and knelt. With both hands, she pressed against the frozen surface, eyes closed. No music played, no speech given, but the people on shore did something rare. They waited, in silence, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice began to shift. Not break, not shatter, but ripple like a memory finally surfacing. Cracks spidered outward, not in chaos, in pattern, the lake whispered. And beneath the thinning surface something appeared. A mark, charred, burned into the rock beneath decades of winter. The shape of a horse. Mid-run, head lifted, eyes open. Next to it a carved musical symbol, a single whole note. Still, complete, eternal. The ice gave one last sigh, and then began to melt. Amelia opened her eyes. She did not cry, not this time. She simply breathed, and the breath was full. As she stood once more at the lake's edge, the people behind her began to sing. Not in unison, not in harmony, just freely. A child humming, an elder whispering, a teenager beatboxing softly under his breath. Each voice its own timbre, each a fragment of the world long held in silence. Amelia closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need to sing to feel whole. She just needed to listen. In the final frame of the film, the screen fades to white. A slow voiceover begins. It is not booming, not melodic, just real, just hers. "I used to believe I had to sing to survive. That silence meant death. That if I couldn't be heard, I wouldn't be known. But maybe freedom was never in the singing. Maybe it was in being heard, even in silence, especially in silence. Because sometimes, being heard is the most beautiful song a soul can ever sing." The screen cuts to black. A final sound echoes. Not a note, not a voice, but a heartbeat. Soft, steady, listening, always.